Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. Today I'm joined by Marvin Vining. He is the author of the book, Jesus the Wicked Priest, How Christianity Was Born of an Essene Schism. So welcome to History Valley, Marvin.
Hi, Jacob.
So could you tell us what led you to the conclusion that the Dead Sea Scrolls are talking about 1st century CE era biblical events? Because in scholarship, typically they say these sectarian documents are talking about either 2nd century BCE events and or 1st century BCE events and have nothing to do with the historical Jesus in the sense that he's not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but you do think he's in there. And you think he's the one called the wicked priest, an opponent of somebody called the teacher of righteousness.
Correct, right. Well, I'll try to give you the Cliff Notes version of it. I don't know if you can see my screen, but
I'll pull it up now.
Okay. Or actually, I was going to show you something on camera. Barbara Thiering, I don't know if you can see this book. Okay, so she originally came up with the idea that Jesus was the wicked priest. She's one of a couple of alternative scholars, her and Robert Eisenman. But her work was largely discredited by the main body of scholars. However, back sometime around 1992, I was reading this book. It's called Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's by James Charlesworth, and it has a collection of scholars. And anyway, I came across chapter 2. It was written by a scholar named Otto Betz. He's now dead. He's a famous New Testament scholar at Tübingen. And anyway, he took over the Temple Scroll, which is 1QH, from his predecessor. And they basically did an exegesis. There's a couple of references in the New Testament to a group called the Herodians. And Yigael Yadin, Otto Betz's predecessor, had identified the Herodians in one gospel passage, and Betz thought that he missed one. In Mark 3, it describes Jesus in front of a group of Pharisees and Herodians. And then it says that he healed a man with a withered hand. And I've always been drawn to that because I have a withered hand. And so anyway, that's a very important gospel passage to me. What that is it's really the turning point of Jesus's whole ministry. From that point forward, they were hunting him down to crucify him. So anyway, what's going on in that passage is Jesus heals the man with a withered hand, and he does it on the Sabbath, and then the Pharisees and Herodians rush out to plan his death. Okay, so that right there gives you the global interpretation of the Jesus as wicked priest hypothesis, because it shows Jesus in opposition to the Herodians. And Betz and Yadin had concluded that the Herodians were the Essenes that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they did this. It's very complicated. I'd have to get into details of the book, but basically what he does was he identifies a passage where in another verse, it's either, I think it's Matthew's verse, it says they mention a beast falling into the pit on the Sabbath, and which one of you has a beast in the pit will not rescue that. Well, that was a direct reference to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So at that point, Betz concluded that the Herodians must have been the Essenes. But then if you follow that through, if you look at all the parallels, what Betz was doing there is he was performing a harmonization. He was like looking at parallel gospel passages. And, this is kind of like working with an elephant. You can feel a piece of the elephant, it feels like a post, and you can feel the chest of the elephant feels like a wall, but all together you have a big picture of the elephant. So anyway, what Betz was able to do was to identify the Essenes as the Herodians in the gospel. Well, if you look at Luke's version doesn't say Pharisees and Herodians, it says Pharisees and scribes. Well, now that's really interesting, because the scribes appear over 50-something times throughout the New Testament Gospels and also Book of Acts. And they're not just minor players like the Herodians are. The scribes are always in league with the Pharisees, and they held a major role in hunting Jesus down and crucifying him and challenging his scriptural views and so forth. So if that were the case, I said, well, now that makes a lot of sense, because the Essenes were they were the third sect and really a major sect of Judaism alongside the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But they're never really mentioned in the New Testament, which doesn't make sense, because if they're around, they should have been there. But they were there. So what do you call a group that's writing all the time and interpreting scrolls? You call them scribes. I think that's what the first century Jews would have said. So anyway, from there, I started putting together my reconstruction, and it's complicated because the radiocarbon dating has been misinterpreted quite a bit. The big problem is the early Dead Sea Scroll scholars didn't realize that the Essenes believed in reincarnation. Okay, so there's a reference to this teacher of righteousness, but he appears about 150 years earlier than Jesus was supposed to have lived. Well, but you see the same sort of thing when you're looking at references to the Dalai Lama. You know, the Dalai Lama is never referred to by name, referred to him as pseudonym, like the Dalai Lama. They don't say specific person. So it's the same sort of thing with the righteous teacher. He occurred at least a couple of times that we know of. And the later teacher of righteousness is the one who interacted directly with Jesus. In the Naum commentary and the Habakkuk commentary and so forth, actually several different scrolls. But for some reason, a lot of the mainstream Dead Sea Scroll scholars don't believe that the radiocarbon dating supports it. It actually supports it quite good. The Naum commentary 4Q71, it was dated from 5 to 111 CE, and it speaks of this wicked priest and shifting verb tenses, which means that the wicked priest had to have been alive when it was drafted. Okay, so that's pretty much dead on. And even under Giza Vermeij's view, who came up with the original dating of the teacher of righteousness, he's too early. Okay, so if you look at the Habakkuk commentary, for example, I mean he's off. He's off as much as my figure is off, but my figure actually makes sense because the references to the Jesus as the wicked priest and the teacher of righteousness could have been written on could have been written on stored scrolls. So anyway, that's the long and short of it. There are many more details that are a lot more technical, dates, the reconstruction of his trial and so forth. But anyway, that's the start of it.
Why do you identify Jesus as the wicked priest? What are the most important points in your view that shows that they're the same character?
Well, it has to do with what he did. When you know what you're looking at in certain of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're reading about the gospel from the point of view of Jesus's enemies. Like, for example, let's see if I can find this. There it is. Okay. I don't know if you can pull up the screen I'm looking at. Okay, this is from a paper I've written where I've revised my research actually since the book was published. The book was published in 2008, but I revised this paper from year to year just to keep up with the latest. Okay, so if you look, what you have there at the top is a reference to the Habakkuk Pesha. And a Pesha is it's a midrash. It's hard to describe. It's a little technical, but basically what they're doing is they're going through the Hebrew Bible and they're pulling out references to prophecies and so forth, but they're interpreting them in terms of present day. It's a lot like what Christians do in like the 700 Club. You know, we call this newspaper exegesis, where they're basically trying to interpret modern day events in terms of what they see as prophetical references in the past. And a lot of the reasons they did that was because, they were under occupation at the time. So they were trying to keep their references, hidden and so forth. Okay, so what you have here is a reference to Habakkuk chapter 2. It says, because of the blood of the city and the violence done to the land. And they interpret that as the city Jerusalem, where the wicked priest committed abominable deeds and defiled the temple of God. All right, so right below that, you have Mark's parallel account of this event. And they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple and began to cast out the money changers and overthrow the temples and so forth. The scribes and chief priests heard about it, how they might destroy him because the people were astonished at his doctrine. Okay, so you see, I think those are parallel references. I think that's the wicked priest is how the scrolls authors, the Essenes, are interpreting the events of Jesus trashing the temple and throwing out the money changers, and the scribes. That's well, they are these things, and that's so what you're seeing a lot of times. In certain of the scrolls, not all of them, but certain of the scrolls, you're seeing the backdrop of the Gospels from the point of view of Jesus' enemies.
Did he oppose the righteous teacher? Because in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the wicked priest seems to be portrayed that way, and at one point, he launches an attack, a physical assault on the righteous teacher.
Well, I'm not sure if it's a physical attack. That comes down to the Mark 3 passage I was telling you about. I think I think the teacher of righteousness was the man who had the withered hand. And I can bring up, there's a really good reference to that. Hold on. Let's see here. Oh, hold on. It's a little too technical. Let's go back. It wasn't really an attack so forth as, the teacher of righteousness was very fundamentalist in his scriptural interpretations. And so, okay, let's look at this. It's not a bad. And by the way, this shows how that harmonization of the Gospels method works. Okay, so if you can look at it on screen, what's going on here? And I wish I'd developed these graphics a little bit more in the book. I think it would have simplified things for the reader. Okay, so you see how you have the Pharisees in all three of the synoptic versions. You have Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and then the Pharisees are all there. Well, in Mark's version, you have the Herodians, and in Luke's version, you have the scribes. Matthew's version doesn't have a second group at all, but I think they're there. They were just left out. It's a lot like I'm a trial lawyer. When you have 4 or 5 different witnesses to an accident, you get 4 or 5 different versions. And if you try to harmonize them, sometimes witnesses will pick up something the other witness didn't catch, and so forth. Okay, so I think that's what was going on there. See, and yeah. Anyway, these are all 3 versions that you look at. Let's see. Oh yeah. Okay, so the Matthew version, if you look at that, see where it says the sheep falls in the pit on the Sabbath. Okay, that's how Otto Betts identified the Herodians as the Essenes right there, the Matthew version. But he didn't really carry his work through, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that he didn't respect Barbara Thiering's work at all. I mean, Barbara Thiering's hypothesis that Jesus was the wicked priest, it was already out there. It was out there probably in the mid 80s, maybe even early 80s, something like that. I didn't hear of it until probably the late 80s, early 90s. But anyway, the basic idea that Jesus was the wicked priest was there. The problem is that Thiering had this really strange method of interpreting the New Testament. Okay, she believed in what's called the traditional Qumran Essene hypothesis, that all the scrolls were written at Qumran, or at that settlement they had at Qumran, and they were stored in the caves. All of them were written there. Okay, but that doesn't really make sense to a lot of people. For example, Norman Gold, he said there are too many different handwriting styles that were found in the scrolls for all of them to have been written there. So for my Jesus as wicked priest hypothesis, what I've done is I've actually expanded the Qumran Essene hypothesis. So all of the events that happened that are described in the Gospels didn't occur at Qumran, like Barbara Thiering thought. They actually occurred all over Judea. So, for example, in Mark 3, if you look at where that takes place, it's in a Capernaum synagogue. Well, there you go. Okay, if that's a Capernaum synagogue and the teacher of righteousness was there, that's not an event that occurred at Qumran. It occurred in Capernaum, right? Way up around the Sea of Galilee, which actually makes a lot of sense because Capernaum, Galilee, that whole area was a hotbed of Christian activity, early Christian activity. Okay, so but the problem with Thiering's version, okay, she reads the New Testament and she reads just about all of it symbolically and allegorically. So, for example, if it said Saul was on his way to Damascus, she didn't think that was the actual Damascus. She thought that was an area in Qumran, and that she believed that pretty much all the events that are described throughout the Gospels all took place at Qumran. So she takes the New Testament and she reads it in a way that can't be historically verified, and that's why a lot of Dead Sea Scroll scholars have had problems with her work, because it's not really capable of verification or being falsified one way or the other. Okay, there's nothing fixed about it. That's what's different about my approach, is because I do read the New Testament actually very literally. The Pesha scrolls, you have to read them symbolically because they're meant to be read symbolically. But I think most of what is there actually in the New Testament is, I'll read it as straightforward history. So anyway, I hope that helps.
So, who would the righteous teacher be?
I'm sorry, missed that.
Who is the righteous teacher?
Oh, I believe he was, and this is just a candidate. I can't actually say for sure, but a lot of people have tried to pay him. He may have been different figures throughout history, but during Jesus's era, I think he was Simeon. He was a high priest at Jerusalem that went into exile and was living at Capernaum at the time that Jesus was growing up. At the time that Jesus was preaching, excuse me. So he was believed to be, and this is important because you had different messianic expectations of the Essenes and Jesus. Okay, so there's a passage where the Pharisees and scribes, I'm not sure exactly, they come to John the Baptist and they say, are you Elijah? He says, no. He said, are you the Christ? He says, no. He said, are you the prophet? He says, no. All right, so those are three different figures. And to really understand what's going on in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you need to understand who this prophet is. So this prophet, I believe, was the teacher of righteousness. And I believe he was Moses incarnate, actually. I think that's why these things held in such high esteem. Okay, and there are references to it. It's hard to flesh it all out in an interview. You'd have to pick it up in the book or the paper. But anyway, one of the reasons Jesus broke from these people is because the Essenes had a very limited expectation of who Jesus would be. And there's a really good book. I don't have a hard copy, or I'd flashed on the screen, by Joel Marcus. I think it's about John the Baptist, the theology of John the Baptist, something like that. Came out in 2017. And I've been waiting on a scholar like Marcus to come along for years. He's concluded that John the Baptist was raised in Essene. Okay, so his baptismal ministry and so forth, what he was doing was that he believed that John believed that he personally would provide the last chance at salvation and redemption before Jesus would come along and basically kill everybody. Okay, so they sometimes these messianic expectations are referred to as first Isaiah and second Isaiah. Okay, the first Isaiah messianic expectations, it's sort of like the movie Dune. I don't know if you remember the movie Dune. Okay, that messianic figure was basically a destroyer. He would come along and he would accomplish world peace, but he would do it by military domination and basically killing all of Israel's enemies. Now, the suffering servant version of the Messiah, you find that in the later passages, later chapters, of Isaiah, second Isaiah, it's often called. That's an entirely different figure. The suffering servant is a nonviolent Messiah. Okay, he practices universal love, and he basically extends Judaism to the Gentiles. It's not so much a nationalistic messianic expectation as it is a universal and nonviolent love expectation. And I believe that's why Jesus broke from the Essenes. And interesting, Marx's book, since he believed that John the Baptist was raised in the Essene and was, in furtherance of their messianic expectations, that means by implication that Marcus believed that the Essenes version of Jesus was also similar to my version. Okay, so this idea that Jesus would come along as a destroyer figure, I believe that's exactly why Jesus broke from them. As it says in John 3, Jesus came not to end the world but to save it. So there you go.
Do you connect the Essenes believing in reincarnation to passages in the New Testament that refer to John the Baptist as being Elijah?
Right. Yeah, I missed the first part of your question. Yeah, that's actually one of the more well-known reincarnation passages in all of the New Testament, really. Okay, so the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus goes up the Mount of Transfiguration with some of John the Baptist's former disciples, and on the way down, they ask him, "Master, why did the scribes say that Elijah must first come?" And Jesus says, "He did come. He was John the Baptist." And then they knew he was speaking of John the Baptist, or however it's worded. But anyway, yeah, that's one of the more direct references to reincarnation there is. And in Hebrew, by the way, that's called Gilgal Meshemot, cycle of souls. And it's a little bit difficult to pick up in the New Testament because when people think of reincarnation, they think the soul comes back again and again. No, that's not it. The Hebrew version is that the spirit migrates and a soul and body are formed of its life. Okay, so it's a cycle of souls. And you hear the nashamat, that's plural. Okay, so you have multiple souls, one spirit, multiple souls. And I came up with a word for that in Jesus, so we can preach to help it make a little more sense. Yeah, there it is. Okay, on screen. So metamnemosis, there we go, means the migration of the spirit, not the migration of the soul. Okay. So there are actually some very clear Dead Sea Scroll references to metamnemosis. It's what's called the horoscope scroll. What you have is several men who are described his spirit consists of 6 in the house of light and 3 in the pit of darkness. Okay, and so on. And some of them have more times in the house of light and less times in the house of darkness and so forth. But the neat thing about those horoscopes is their physical description matches up to the number of times that their spirit spent in the postmortem heaven or hell. Okay, and that's a very common reincarnation belief. You find it all over the world. The idea that your physical characteristics reflect your prenatal karma or sin. And you see there in the paper I referenced, the John 9:2, where his disciples asked him, Master, was this man born blind was this man born blind on account of his sin or his parents' sin? Well, if it's his sin, then that can only be prenatal sin, of course. And by the way, this is a fairly common Jewish belief, at least among Hasidic Jews. If you ask Hasidic Jews, they're often thought to be incorporating Greek ideas and so forth that were never really there in Judaism. But Hasidic Jews will tell you that reincarnation has been there in the Bible all along. You find it all the way back in Genesis, where the serpent sheds its skin, and is reborn. That's a common reference to reincarnation found all over the world.
In page 132 in the book, you're comparing a translation by Vermas and Eisman and Wise, a pierced or piercing Messiah 4Q 285.
Right. Yeah. I wish I were further along in my Hebrew study at the time and could done something with that. But actually, that's even if I had 6 years of Hebrew behind me. That's a very important study. Okay. What that has to do with is whether the Messiah was pierced or piercing. Okay. If he's a piercing Messiah, then it goes to that first Isaiah interpretation of Messiah. Okay. In fact, I think I've got a paper here. Let me see if I can. Hold on just a sec. But I think Giza Vermes actually had. There it is. I think Giza Vermes actually had the correct idea. I think the there it is. Okay. Can you pull what I'm looking at on screen here? Piercing Messiah.
Yeah, I see the screen. It's I think due to delay, it's taking a moment to load.
Sure. Yeah, it'll pop up probably in a sec. Okay, so basically, if it's a piercing Messiah, then the Messiah would do the piercing. If it's a Messiah who's pierced, then it would suggest a suffering servant version of the messianic figure. Okay, so let's see. How do they? I think Vermes probably has the piercing interpretation. Yep. Vermes had the traditional first Isaiah piercing version, and Eisman and Wise tried to interpret this passage as the suffering servant version, and you can see what a big difference this makes. I think Vermes was actually right. I want to believe. Oh, I'm sorry. We have thunderstorms here. I hope you can pick that up. It's just started thundering and raining here really heavy. Okay, so I do believe that Vermes is correct. Most of the messianic expectations I read in the scrolls are of the first Isaiah, and not the second Isaiah. But you can see how it's really touchy. I mean, with these translations that you can see side by side, they're so close. They're so close. And by the way, the righteous teachers, some of the early Dead Sea Scrolls scholars, very early, they wanted to believe that Jesus was the righteous teacher. Because he seemed to be the central figure of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he actually is the central figure of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes were they were a Levitical sect, okay, and they believed that this teacher of righteousness would be the main messianic figure. Jesus would be secondary to him, pretty much like the Dalai Lama and his regent. Okay, so that makes a big difference, because in the Essenes messianic worldview, the teacher of righteousness, would have ran the show, and Jesus would have been just his military enforcer. And Jesus interpreted it entirely different than that. And I said the main difference is, Jesus basically tried to open Judaism to the Gentiles and believe in universal love. That's the central teaching, and that's why he departed the Essenes. So, by the way, the Sermon on the Mount, if you understand where that takes place, that's probably within days of that Mark 3 passage I was telling you about, where Jesus healed the righteous teacher, and he's out there preaching, right amongst the teacher's former disciples who are about to depart from him and switch over to Jesus. So you probably had thousands of people there who were, and that's the real birth of Christianity. There is, and if you look at the title to the book, How Christianity was Born of an Essene Schism, that's where it all really takes place, in Capernaum, where Jesus is pulling those disciples away from the Essenes who are about to follow him.
So you're saying that basically Christianity is virtually the Essenes renamed and modified?
More or less, yes. I don't think Jesus ever intended to start another religion. I think he was basically just trying to do a reformed Jewish movement. But I do think he believed himself, the Messiah, and his interpretation of Messiah, like I said, was a good bit different than the Essenes. They all believed they were living in an apocalyptic age. Okay, the Essenes, Jesus, John the Baptist, all of them. They all believed they were living at a time of history in which something was going to happen. They were either going to overthrow the Romans militarily or some spiritual event. And I think Jesus basically interpreted the prophecies and everything that was going to happen to him just in a nonviolent sense. I think he willingly chose to die on the cross and chose a nonviolent death in order to accomplish something very different than going out and being a general. But let me say, as I bring this up, there's often an anti-Semitic trope that Jews are violent. Jesus came along and he was preaching nonviolent to the traditionally violent Jews. That's entirely wrong, because you got to understand that Jesus, he was born within first century Judaism, and so his teaching is nonviolence and universal love. That's the first century Jewish idea. So what you have basically going on is an intra-Jewish struggle about pacifism, the role of violence, and so forth. And this is a very good lesson today, by the way, because you have America that's this huge military power, and we often defend Israel for many times the wrong reasons. I think we defend them militarily and so forth. Not that Israel didn't have the right to defend themselves like any other country. Of course they do, but I think Jesus' approach was entirely different. Even the idea that we're a Christian nation, that wouldn't make any sense to Jesus at all, because he was nonviolent, believed in universal love. The idea that you would have some super military power as a Christian nation, I think that would be abhorrent to Jesus and all the first century Christians.
Do you think the righteous teacher is mentioned in the New Testament elsewhere, other than being the man of a withering hand?
Simeon, yeah, I think he was the same priest in the temple, when Jesus came by, and he may have been other figures. I don't know how much of the book you've read. I hate to give the book away because it has kind of a neat story to it. I think the righteous teacher was Jesus' biological father. He was believed to be the angel Gabriel. Okay, so he's mentioned there. And Thiering she came about this in a really strange way, and I probably wouldn't have even picked it up for her. But she said that and certain angelic figures like Michael and Gabriel and so forth, that they were carrying through certain bloodlines, and I actually got the idea that the teacher of righteousness was Gabriel by reading some of Thiering's work, and I never probably would have put it together otherwise. But I don't necessarily believe in all of her details. I think she had a lot of things wrong. For example, she wanted to put John the Baptist in there as the righteous teacher or something like that. I think there are three different figures, and that's one of the reasons that people get them all mixed up. But she came pretty close, probably closer than most. And I really don't see where she got a lot of her stuff, to be perfectly honest with it, because her means of reading the New Testament were so allegorical and just really, I don't see where she pulled a lot of this stuff from. But the basic idea that Jesus was raised in Essene and broke from them and so forth, I think you can get there through traditional, more rigid Dead Sea Scrolls scholars' work. For example, Otto Betz. Otto Betz actually really attacked Thiering. He was very savage of her, and it's one of the reasons that I don't think he ever was able to link his work up to hers. I don't know if you can see this on camera. I've got a personal letter here. That's actually from Otto Betz. I wrote him years ago, just as my book was about to come out. I asked him if he had any commentary, but I don't think he was quite able to appreciate how his own work supported Thiering. I think it would have been very difficult for him to do an about face, because he had pretty much trashed her, and like most of the Orthodox Dead Sea Scrolls scholars have done.
Who would be the spreader of lies?
Probably the same figure as Jesus. There may have been different figures. I don't know. I do think that James, Jesus' brother, was also a very important figure to the early Christians in the Essenes. I think there's even a reference to Saul, who later renamed himself Paul. I think he was probably the furious young lion. Okay, let's see if I can find him here. Okay, so on screen, the thing is, the Dead Sea Scrolls actually mention Jesus' crucifixion in pretty good detail. They don't mention the crucifixion itself so much as they do him being flogged and so forth, but they do mention, the scrolls do mention Jesus' crucifixion after the fact. So if you can see on screen, what this is a pascha on a verse from the Noun commentary. And you see where it says, "A furious young lion, he executes revenge upon those who seek smooth things and hangs men alive. Because of a man hanged alive on the tree, he proclaims, behold, I'm against you." Okay, so I think that may have been Paul or Saul, before his conversion. It seems to me to make a lot of sense, because he was at this point, what you're looking at is the crucifixion of the early Christians, persecution and crucifixion of early Christians by what's left of the Essene hierarchy. Okay, so teacher of righteousness is probably dead at this point. John the Baptist is certainly dead. He was beheaded, and so you have probably a new hierarchy taking hold. But if we take the New Testament at its face value, and it talks about Paul's conversion, which is, I think, is pretty remarkable. But yeah, I think the man of the lie probably could have been, probably more than likely the man of the lie was Jesus. I need to go through and do some more detailed reconstruction on that, but I still need to put that on the to-do list. And by the way, let's see, why we have this paper up. Let me look all the way at the tail end here. I came up with a discovery just last year. Let me see if I can find it. Yep, there it is. Okay. All right. So Yigael Yadin, he did a reconstruction that Otto Betz built upon, showing that the Herodians were the Essenes. All right. If you've studied the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of the scholars out there believe that the Essenes or the group that wrote them. But some don't. Okay, this was the big dispute between Norman Gold and Larry Schiffman. All right, so Gold thought that you had this group of literature that was really taken from all over Judea, from all the different sects in Judaism and so forth, and they were all gathered there at Qumran. But Schiffman said, no, that doesn't really make any sense because the scrolls have a sectarian bent to them. You know, they really are. They seem to be written by one sect, not all the different sects, but one sect. Okay. The difference is, however, Schiffman believes that the Sadducees were the ones who wrote the scrolls, not the Essenes. But I don't know. He may have been right. If you look at this screen I've got, it shows, you know, the Pharisees and then the Herodians as the second group. But I never realized this until sometime last year. If you look at the Matthew version, the second group are actually Sadducees. Okay, so this is really interesting. So it could have been that Schiffman was right and that Sadducees were another name for the Essenes or something. And that kind of makes sense because Sadducees, you know, they mean sons of Zadok, and that's a term you often find in the scrolls too. So incidentally, I met with Schiffman around 2009, I think it was. I was in Memphis and they had a big Dead Sea Scroll conference there. And anyway, he did a paper arguing that Jesus couldn't possibly have been associated with the Essenes because you had all this disagreement about purity laws and so forth, that the Essenes were really fanatical about following purity laws, like you find, for example, in Matthew 23. Well, I talked with Larry afterwards and I said, you know, you realize, I said, my schism theory perfectly answers every objection you had in your paper. Yeah, Jesus was raised with this group, but he broke from them. Hence, he would have had opposition, you know, to these things, just like you say he did. So anyway, I think it'd be interesting to see where this Sadducees research goes, because like I said, Larry is one of the, he's one of the last to come aboard the whole Qumran Essene hypothesis. And by the way, I don't know if you can do a cutaway to me. I've got a book I'm holding up. It's called Out of the Cave, Philosophical Inquiry into the Dead Sea Scroll Research by Edna Ullman Margulies. She's dead now, but she was a philosopher of science at the University of, where did she teach? Oh, yeah, Hebrew University, Jerusalem. Right. So she came from a different background. She came from a philosophy background like I did, and not necessarily a biblical background. So I'm still looking to get my PhD, but she and I had a great deal in common about philosophy. But she said one of the problems with the Dead Sea Scroll research is that pretty much all the data has been gathered at this point, and it usually when you have a major theorem or a hypothesis, you know, like evolution or so forth, the scientists are either going to agree or disagree after all the data has been gathered in. And if they're disagreeing, that means that there's either some adjustment that needs to be made to the underlying hypothesis, or else the scholars have been irrational in how they're interpreting the hypothesis. And she said the Qumran Essene hypothesis has been around long enough now that really everyone ought to believe in it, but they don't. You know, you still have, you know, major groups out there like, you know, Larry Schiffman, for example, who thinks the Sadducees wrote the scrolls. So I think, you know, maybe if I continue my research, we may be able to get them all around to my version of the Qumran Essene hypothesis. But like I said, it's very modified because it's not the traditional Qumran Essene hypothesis where all the scrolls were written there at Qumran and then gathered in the caves. I think they were written all over Judea. And by the way, we're just now getting evidence that those scrolls were written all over. Oh, yeah, here we go. Okay, so Norman Gold and Schiffman, this big debate that they have as to whether the scrolls are sectarian or whether they're written all over the place. All right. I think we've had Scientific American. There's an article that mentioned recent DNA tests that were run upon the scrolls that confirmed some of them were written elsewhere than Qumran. So we're finally getting to the point where we're getting some scientific confirmation of the theory that hadn't been available until now. And let me see, 46. Yep. Scientific American. I think that came out sometime a year or two ago. So very exciting stuff. We're finally living in a time where we're finally getting some scientific confirmation of my work here.
So to conclude this, how would you summarize the theological beliefs of the historical Jesus real quick?
Oh, I'm sorry. Thunder just popped right in your question. I'm sorry, one more time.
So to conclude this talk, how would you summarize the theological beliefs of the historical Jesus?
My personal theological beliefs? Well, that's an interesting question. They've shifted a lot through the years.
Actually,
I began studying.
that's fine, but I also asked, but the question I was originally asking is, what were the theological beliefs of the historical Jesus?
Oh, his theological beliefs.
But you could talk about
That's a
yours
good
too if you
question.
want.
Yeah. And you mean the theological beliefs that Jesus personally held?
Yes.
Yes, that's a good question. Well, for one thing, I deny the virgin birth. Man, that's loud. I hope you can hear that. It's thundering like crazy here. In the book, I deny the virgin birth, and that's always been a source of controversy between Jews and Christians. I do think that Jesus's birth was believed to be some sort of miracle because, like I said, the teacher believed himself to be the reincarnation of an angel. Okay, and there was actually a tradition in Judaism where you would have heroic offspring that were born of angels and so forth. So when I say that, I deny the virgin birth, that's not necessarily to completely deny the whole tradition of the virgin birth. I just think that what you have are people writing about it after the fact who have a vague idea of this Jewish tradition of angels and so forth that was around earlier. Okay. And of course, the Septuagint's version mentions virgin, but the Masoretic does not. And the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to be in agreement that Isaiah passage that talks about the young woman giving birth and so forth. So I don't think you can say that the earliest and authentic Hebrew text mentioned anything about a virgin birth. So that seems to be a Christian idea that took hold. So in terms of whether Jesus thought of himself as a divine figure, I think that goes directly to that. I don't think Jesus is any more or less divine than the rest of us. By that I mean I think he practiced a non-dualist form of mysticism, like Advaita Vedanta. So in the end of John's Gospel, for example, where he's praying to God for his disciples that are present and those who would come after, he says, "As you, Father, are in me and I am in you, so they may be in us one." Right. So that's a non-dualist idea. I think Jesus basically, believed that he and the Creator were one. But that's not such a radical idea. I mean, Eckhart talked about that, and also Shankara. Okay, and in non-dualist Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta philosophy, for example. So I do believe he thought he had a unique messianic role as far as being able to forgive sins. But that is a very long discussion. I'd refer you to the book. When you look at sins and how they're forgiven, and the idea of, a lot of people think, okay, Jesus is the incarnation of God. That's going to completely answer how he can forgive sins. No, it really doesn't, because in Judaism, they had this bifurcated concept of sin where you had sin against God and sin against someone, right? So if I sin against you and you don't forgive me, that sin is still upon me, right? That's basically what the whole Jewish holiday of the Day of Atonement is about. The idea is that, we all meet in temple and we're supposed to atone to one another. Pretty much like Christians are doing when we do the communion. We sit down and we take the Lord's Supper. We're supposed to atone for one another and forgive one another our sins and participate in the communion cup. Okay, so I think Jesus believed himself as integral to forgive us of sins, but not just sin against God. Because, like I said, the incarnation may answer that, but I believe he thought he could help us forgive our sins one unto another, which is really what the whole question of universal love is about. In fact, if you look at the Lord's Prayer, and specifically what he says there, I think it's entirely possible for someone to be Christian who's never even heard of Jesus or the gospel or anything like that. Basically, what he taught in the Lord's Prayer, he says, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, right? And elsewhere, Jesus says that our sins are forgiven as we forgive. So, if you really practice universal love in your heart and you forgive everything that everyone has ever done to you, then your sins are forgiven. That's pretty much that simple. So I think Jesus believed that he was central to that he had, a message to teach, and that he was a lot more important than just being some sort of, general or avenging military destructive figure or something like that. So to put it in a nutshell, Stanley Hauerwas, I admire him a lot. He refers to himself as an Anabaptist, which I think of myself as an Anabaptist, even though I was raised in, traditional mainstream Christianity. He said, nonviolent and universal love. He said, that's the heart of the gospel. The rest is bullshit. I'm paraphrasing, but Stanley Hauerwas likes to cuss a lot. So.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Marvin Vining.
Oh, you bet. Enjoyed it.
Conversation, and I thank everybody else in the chat for their participation in the live chat. And I will see all of you later.
Sounds great.
Thanks.
Enjoyed it.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.